Hey guys, Daniel James here, and today is the pilot episode of an idea I've had for a while. This is going to be an interactive talk radio style live stream. And the concept behind this is we will have a topic for the day. As you can see above me here, today's topic is going to be music theory. Is it essential for modern composers? And what we're going to do is I'm going to share some opinions on the topic, but also we're going to have people from the chat room calling in live via Discord. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to go to twitch.tv/hybrid2 so you can catch these live and join in. But yeah, anyway, so you'll be calling into the show via Discord, and I want to hear your opinions on the topic. And, hopefully this can be a healthy discussion that we can, over time build up a not a general consensus, but we can build up a place where we have an archive of these questions that are asked all the time in our industry, and we can hear the general kind of vibe that people are having with said topics, which is a really weird way of saying that. Anyway, so today's topic is music theory. Is it essential for modern composers? Now, for those of you who know anything about me, I actually came into the industry via musical sound design. So when I started in the industry, you can look below in the Twitch stream to see some of the credits of the things I've worked on. But I've done a few video games, like I've helped out on some Call of Duties. I worked on Metal Gear Solid 5 and things like that. So I've worked on a few things of note. But when I started in the industry, I couldn't afford, like many people, I couldn't afford the sample libraries with which to compete on a professional level when it comes to musical kind of music writing. All I could really afford was a DAW and a microphone. So when I started, I came in from sound design first. And I don't know if you know this, there isn't much music theory when it comes to sound design. And so what I would do is I would make these big rhythmic beds and synthesize stuff, like I was one of those one-key composers, you push the thing of do-do-do-do-do-do-do. And I learned that you could compose with texture just as well as you could with melody in certain situations, not in all situations. Anyway, so when I started in the industry, I didn't have any music theory. And, I obviously wasn't getting the gigs I was now. And then I did 2 years at college where I learned some basics of music theory. I was training to be a singer. But during that time, they did teach us some music theory. And the way I always felt about it is music theory to me felt like a cheat sheet. It felt like a list of things that have been proven to work, but you don't necessarily need them. So to me, I never saw music theory as essential. Like, obviously, the more you know, the more options you have when it comes to it. But me personally, I never found it essential, at least to get going. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. So I'm gonna try and start off. Let's try dragging someone in, and hopefully their microphones are working. So the Metalborn, you are live on the stream. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can. Hello,
the Metalborn, welcome. Finally, it works.
Hi.
It works.
I just moved and my entire house is in shambles.
In shambles, but yet you made the effort to get your microphone set up, which I genuinely appreciate, sir. So tell me, music theory, is it essential for modern composers? What's your thoughts on the topic?
I think that I kind of agree with what you said. It's kind of like a really nice cheat sheet that you can go back to, right, and it's been proven to work. But there is that kind of what would the word be? If you're just doodling on something, the kind of randomness can be also musical that may not follow a music theory mindset.
Right. Do you feel that music theory sometimes restricts the way people think about music? Perhaps they are writing something and their brain says, oh, this doesn't work according to music theory. Do you think that happens as often as people make out, or not?
Oh, it happens to me every day.
It happens to you every day. So you sit down, you begin writing, and then you come up with a cool thing. You're like, but that doesn't really work according to rule X, Y.
Absolutely.
So for the modern composer, do you feel like that they should avoid it? Is that what you feel?
That's a tough one. I think that really just kind of doodling and just playing around with different ideas, maybe having right now I have like a really core idea for something I'm working on, and it's pretty like set in stone. Like I like this a lot. This probably will not change. But the next part, I've written like 4 different like new passages that could work,
Right.
but I haven't said, okay, that's the one kind of thing.
Right.
So
yeah, well, one of the ways I've always thought of music theory, like I'm literally on the fence on this topic because I know quite a lot of music theory by this point, but at no point have I ever felt it was essential. Although I did come up with this this comparison, and you can let me know if you like it, but I always compare it to a catapult, right? Which is I know, hear me out.
Yeah.
Like a
No,
catapult.
go ahead.
So if you walk up to a catapult without knowing the physics behind how it works, you can still pull that handle and fuck shit up. You know what I mean? You can still launch a rock and hurt some stuff. However, if you understand the physics of trajectory and, all this kind of stuff, you're more likely to hit a target if you know what the target is. So if we compare that to music theory, do you think it's possible that even though to some people they may feel it stifles their creativity, do you not think that perhaps knowing music theory, if they know what they want to achieve, it could actually help get there quicker or more specifically?
I do think I kind of agree with you. Having music theory will if you have an idea in your mind, having music theory or how music theory works, having that mindset will, I think, get you more to what you're trying to achieve than if you're just trying to, I guess, I'm kind of running over my own words, but spitballing. I feel like if, again, you have an idea and you want to execute it properly, I think having music theory would help you in that scenario.
And do you think that music theory is static or dynamic? Because music theory that we have when we read a textbook is obviously referring to like the classical eras, like the orchestra. However, technology has moved beyond the orchestra. You have to remember that for the longest time, the orchestra as we know it today was the peak, and for the longest time was the peak of technology in music. That was so music theory was built around it. However, recently with the the advent of computers and synthesizers and things like that, music isn't as set in stone as it used to be. So do you think that music theory is actually a little bit more dynamic, I think is the correct word for it? Do you feel that it's changing now, or do you feel that music theory will always be the same and people will always consider the more modern techniques of, say, loops or synthesized presets? Do you feel that these will never be included in music theory, or do you feel that it should be included as part of music theory?
I think with like getting into the more dynamics of today's age, I think it is probably going to change. I think it already has in some scenarios, with newer beats and newer pads and textures and all that kind of fun stuff that you can do now, with Keep Forest, their one trailer hit library. It's just so customizable. But yeah, I think it is changing over kind of the whole kind of.
Well, yeah, of course,
I guess area.
I think I agree with you, and unfortunately, we are agreeing quite a lot. So I am going to move on to another caller. Thank you so much, the Metalborn, for calling in. Do feel free to call again today if you have more to add to the topic. But everybody in the chat, please say thank you to the Metalborn. Do you want to say anything to the chat before you leave?
Daniel James rocks.
Awesome.
Love your channel.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so everybody say thank you to the Metalborn there. So as you heard, we have one opinion there that joins with mine in a weird way. That okay, to a degree, it joins with mine. So what it felt like he was saying there, and I apologize, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Metalborn, but what he was saying is music theory these days has the potential to stifle creativity. Do you agree with that viewpoint? Not everybody will, but let's try bringing in Damaris. Damaris, can you hear me, sir? You are live on the stream.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
It's working. It's working great. I can hear you fantastically. So music theory, is it essential for the modern composer?
So I'm going to break it down. I'm going to say no. We can make music in today. We have so many tools today compared to, 10 years ago even?
Yeah, absolutely.
we can make. There's plenty of composers and producers that make music without or with very little knowledge of music theory.
Right.
But I mean, as someone that didn't come from a music theory background,
Hmm.
and I'm just slowly learning it still, like trying to master it essentially, I think it helps. Like the
So
catapult.
you are trying to
I
learn music theory, so you see some value in it, perhaps.
I think if you want to get ahead, you want to. I mean, Dexter put it really well in the stream chat. If you want to master your craft, you need to know everything about it. I mean, you can
Do you,
get from
do
A
you
to
think it's
B,
possible
but
to know everything about music theory?
no, but you need to know like a great foundation, right? Like
Right.
you can get from A to B fine. Like let's say without music theory,
Yeah.
probably takes you 10 times longer to get
Right.
from A to B. You know, just throwing numbers out there, but there's some people that aren't interested in it and just kind of want to see what comes out.
Well, exactly. Like, so one thing, like, if I can speak from personal experience here, one thing that I often found when I began in the industry, before I knew the amount of music theory that I know now, I did find that it was a more blissful ignorance, if that makes sense. I was unaware of the fact that I was breaking rules, which isn't always great, you know. And again, the music of the past I listen to now and kind of cringe. But there was a certain kind of ignorance in the bliss. It was more fun because I didn't know that the rule was there telling me I couldn't do that. I was more likely to try things. Does that make sense? Like I felt like there was no restrictions on what I could do. If I wanted to do parallel fifths, by God, I was going to do parallel. You know what I mean? There was no restrictions on it. Do you feel that music theory places restrictions on modern composers?
I think if you're early in the stages of knowing it or learning it, or you don't fully understand all the aspects of it, totally. If I look back at old compositions when I was first, you know, still trying to get used to composing and trying to find my edge, yeah, I was doing random things, but like if I look back at it now, I'm like, oh, that was kind of cool. Like what inspired me to come up with that? Like, how did I get to that point? And now today, I'm like, feel like jumping from one key to another is like, oh, that's weird. You know what I mean? Like
that's actually that's a good point that you've touched on there. And it's something that I noticed as well is sometimes in the past, I've written something and then a few years later, I've forgotten how I've written it, how I wrote it, sorry. And then I've found that the more music theory I've learned, I can look back at the music that I wrote and couldn't remember how I did, and then be able to at least work out using the concepts of music theory how roughly I ended up at that point. Do you think that's a positive point for music theory education?
Yeah, I mean, earlier you said there's, you know, it was almost more a blissful experience when you learn music theory because you knew like your mind automatically goes to like, oh, okay, the chords in this progression, you know, I can go from this to that, or this key works together with this key. But then at the same time, you're like, you get into those days where you're like, I want to do something weird. Like, I just want to like create and I don't want to feel limitation. So I think there's a middle ground for maybe like people who weren't brought up on a, you know, music theory background that are now in this era of like, you know, DAW work. That little middle null is where you're still trying to understand every aspect. And when you understand every aspect or like, you know, the basic fundamental aspect of it, then you can go, okay, now it's easy to break rules because I know it.
Yeah.
So I think it's just like,
so let me propose this to you in another way. I touched upon it with the last caller, but do you think that music theory needs to be updated to include the technology of today?
Maybe. It's okay. So I think that's a hard one because we're still trying to figure out what all this means. It's like, are you a Hans Zimmer composer or are you a John Williams composer? You know what I mean? Like people are making those discerning differences.
Let me phrase it like this. So like, for example, textures, being able to make drones and pads using computers. Back in the day, if you wanted to create a similar kind of effect, you would rely on, that would be more into orchestration than music theory. Mm-hmm. But do you feel like these kinds of concepts should be considered at least in, let's say, like a new edition of a music theory textbook, like the techniques of film score that have, because music essentially works based on context. You know, sad music is only sad because we associate it with sad. There's nothing objectively sad about a minor chord. It's just we hear it as sad because, you know, it's applied over time into our cultural context to mean sad. So do you feel like some of the techniques that have come from like the movie industry, for example, like you mentioned, like a Hans Zimmer or, you know, a John Williams, perhaps, you know, they have put forward concepts which in the past may not have meant what they do now. Do you feel that music theory needs to reflect the modern use of certain techniques? And do you feel that they've changed over time?
Yeah, I would agree. Yes, because we're in a new era of, like you said, even let's say 40 years ago, when it was like DAW work was just like, it wasn't really there, sound design, things like that. It was all orchestration. We have books and theory and discussions all about that. And then we hit like year 2000, like early 2000s, where like we just blew up of this information age and like just everything out there, like almost too much information. Like, and I think we're still trying to organize that into like, okay, what's the new age orchestration? So I think we're on the edge of, yes, we need to document some stuff, you know?
So just before we end this call here, so your opinion is music theory is not, and the key word, essential for the modern composer.
Correct. It will help.
it will help, but not as, I mean, particularly with things like, I don't know if you've seen this, there are now plugins which fill in the gap for music theory, you know, ones that will give you chord progressions. I forget the name of them. I think there's like Chordify or something like this. So you tell the application, the app, you know, what your starting chord is, perhaps what your ending chord is, and it can suggest to you ones that would work. Now that
Scalar
is using exactly, that is offsetting musical theory knowledge onto the machine. Do you think that that's a valid way of creating music? Like, so the music theory is being used, but you didn't need to know it beforehand. You can now offset that to an application. Do you think that's a legitimate way of composing?
It's hard to say what's legitimate, but I don't think so, because what happens is you get so used to that tool that you're let's say over a year of doing that, you make a year's worth of compositions using Scalar. You start offloading that knowledge, you know, elsewhere. So you stop thinking about the theory and maybe replace it with something else good, but then you start relying on
if I could just rephrase this to another industry, perhaps let's imagine that like long form mathematics, you know, like algebra and things like these, a lot of these kinds of equations can now be offset to a computer, so that even now someone who isn't really great with with mathematics, with the use of the internet and, you know, deep learning and things like this, they can offset some of that hardcore work to the machine. And is it not the end result that is more important than the means? You know, do the ends justify the means? If at the end of the day you end up writing an amazing piece of music, but you used an application, does it matter that you used an app to cover your lack of music theory?
That is a very interesting point. So technically, no, it doesn't. Because if you deliver something, masterpiece, you know, that's what it is. Doesn't matter how you got there.
And that's why this topic is such an odd one to talk about. So Damaris, thank you for calling in on this question. There will be chances later. So if you want to call in again, you know, maybe at the question time at the end of the show, you know, please do stick around. And thank you so much for calling in. Anything you want to say to the stream before we move on?
I love you, chat. I don't know.
He loves you, chat. Thanks. Everybody say thank you to Damaris, everyone. Thank you, Damaris, for calling in. Fantastic opinions there. So we did touch on a few subjects there. You know, the modern information age, offsetting music theory onto apps. Perhaps these are topics that you have an opinion on beyond the head topic of, is it essential? You know, that is a good thing. Perhaps some of you would like to talk about, you know, if you are pro music theory, perhaps you would like to mention ways in which people could find out more about music theory. I know, for example, I personally learned a lot of my music theory on YouTube as opposed to school. So I know a lot of people who are interested in music theory are maybe reluctant to do it because they think they have to go to a music school in order to do it. But nowadays with things like YouTube, it's not essential. And I know that Dexter has been posting in the chat quite a lot. So let's see if we can get him in the call. Dexter Jetser, can you hear me? Now, I've tried dragging him into the room and his microphone is still muted. So hopefully he can figure that out in a second. If not, we'll move on to the next caller. But let me catch up with a few of the messages in chat. And again, if you are in the chat room today, if you would like If you would like me to read your comment as part of the topic, please put @hybrid2 at the beginning of it. That way it will highlight in my chat room and I'll know that to read it. So Santora's in chat says, I think some people think too much about making music interesting from a theory standpoint and forget to make it interesting from a layman's standpoint. A layman isn't going to know or care that you used Neapolitan, is that correct pronunciation? A Neapolitan chord. And I agree with that. Like, end result, like, it is one of those ends justify the means. So if you are lacking in your music theory, perhaps it is the case that you can offset some of that that lack of some of that ignorance, and I'm not using that as a derogatory term. You can offset some of that ignorance to technology. It looks like Dexter has unmuted his microphone. Can you hear me, Dexter?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Dexter, welcome to the stream. I saw you posting in the chat room. Bear with me. I'm just going to turn you up a little bit because you're quiet. You don't have to do anything your end. So Dexter, music theory, is it essential for the modern composer?
It's interesting when you say like the modern composer, because you brought up a lot of good points. I mean, is theory even relevant anymore now that we have all these?
Right, and let me clarify that. Yeah, so I do say the modern composer, and when I say the modern composer, I think about it in two ways. Firstly, composers who are coming up, so the new generation of composers. I think of it like that. But I also think of it as the composers who have access to the technology from the get-go that people in the past did not. So, like I mentioned with the previous caller, we have access to applications and plugins now, which will fill in that ignorance gap of music theory for you. So when I say modern composer, they're the people I'm talking about. So for those people, is it essential in the modern time?
I think it depends on your perspective. I mean, from like a standpoint, when you have to deliver, really going to care that you use captain chords to
right
progression. But from like a personal standpoint, I mean, your brain is like any other muscle in your body. Like if you don't use it, you're going to lose it.
Right. So, but
in regard to theory,
yeah. Let me put it to you like this. So, music is a very wide subject. It's there's many different aspects to music in which we can all study. There's orchestration, there's synthesis, there's sound design now. Do you think that time would be better spent these days with access to the tools that we do? Would it not be better to spend time learning things that are still applicable to modern composers, more applicable in my opinion, such as orchestration over music theory or synthesis or sampling over music theory? Do you think that these things are perhaps more valuable nowadays than music theory was or is?
I would say, yeah. I'm in New York. I was talking with a composer here that worked on Just Cause,
right?
The one that just came out, and degrees from one of the fancy schools here. And he said, like, if I could do it over again, I would have spent all that time learning Logic and all these synths that I have, instead of the range of a bass clarinet.
Right.
And that's one guy's perspective, but
I mean, there is a kind of confusion. I feel like to some degree of what music theory is. So what you just mentioned there, like the range of a clarinet, that tends to lean more into orchestration than it does music theory. Music theory is one of those like mythical kind of creatures to some people. Music theory is more like, how do I get from this key to that key? If I'm in this chord and I want to make it feel like that, I use that. And that's why I call it a bag of tricks or a cheat sheet, because these days it feels like music theory is just something you reference to see what worked in the past. Whereas nowadays with the app, like an app, like, again, I can't remember what it's called, but like, what did you call it? The Chord Master or something?
Yeah, Captain. I've never used it, but
Captain Chord. Like this is an application which literally takes all that, years of education in order to figure out which chord comes next. And it takes that away from you. So is it actually essential today to know music theory? I mean, in your opinion, of course.
I mean, like, pragmatically, no.
Right. That I think that's a good way of putting it. Pragmatically, not so much. If you could tell people in the chat room what you would rather study than music theory, what would it be? Or would you choose music theory? If you could choose one topic.
One topic. That's tough. I mean,
right?
Part of me still wants to say music theory because just like I like being a purist about things, but talking about pragmatically, I would say probably orchestration. I mean,
Orchestration.
that seems to be the trend.
I thoroughly agree with you there. I've often found, again, if I can only talk from personal experience, I've often found that when I'm composing, I end up thinking more in orchestration than I do in music theory. I'm thinking more about how I say something than what I'm saying. So the demonstration I often use for this, like if you think about it in fonts, right? You know, fonts on a computer. I've seen this as a meme, so I'm not claiming credit for this. But if you wrote "You Will Always Be Mine," you know, in a lovey-dovey font with hearts around it, it has a completely different meaning to if you write it in scratched blood. You know, "You will always be mine." And I feel that music acts in the same way. It's often not so much, or, you know, not completely what you're saying. It's how you're saying it, particularly when it comes to things like film score and TV. You know, you could look at Hans Zimmer's The Joker theme, for example. That is literally one note. But you know what I mean? Like if you played that on a patch, you know, just a normal string patch, it wouldn't be interesting. But the way he said it created the tension, and it said everything it needed to say. Now, music theory wouldn't have a topic on that. Do you understand what I'm trying to say there? It's more about what you say.
Yeah.
And that is an orchestrational technique more than a music theory. There's no music theory in holding a single note per se, if that makes sense.
No. And I think it's kind of just a sign of at least film music, video game music, it's becoming more background music. And
yeah. So you did mention that, like, you are technically on the side of music theory, and you know, again, that is a very valid point. You know, music theory is, you know, very important. Today's topic is more about, is it essential? But do you think, as someone who is pro music theory, do you think that school is essential, or do you think it's possible to learn it nowadays by yourself?
I think you can learn it all by yourself.
Right.
And going to school, and I go to school right now.
Right.
And I think about dropping out like every day.
Right. But I mean, for example, like I wanted to go to school, but unfortunately, I'm not very academically smart. So I didn't have the grades in order to get me into the schools I wanted to go to, which is one of the reasons I ended up going sound design first, which ended up being kind of more beneficial to me in the long term, you know. So for me, it was actually kind of the lack of music theory was almost forced upon me more than my desire to learn it. But I found that it wasn't essential, which is the key word. But anyway, so we have a few more callers lined up. So thank you, Dexter, for talking to us today. Is there anything you would like to say to the chat room before we move on?
No, thank you. Thanks for the show. It's a great idea.
Well, thank you so much for calling in. Everybody in the chat room, please say thank you to Dexter for his awesome opinions there. I'm going to go through and read some of the chat room chat room comments that we've had. Nick Gypsy says, I have a degree in music. I find it easier to evolve ideas knowing traditional technique. Now, that is very, very close to how I feel on the topic. So, again, I call music theory like a cheat sheet. Nowadays, because we live in the information age, if I'm unsure of a technique or something, I don't need to intrinsically know it. I don't need to have studied it in order to know it. The same with history. Like, look at history. There was a time where if you wanted to know the Roman history, for example, you would go study and you would remember the information. Nowadays, if I'm like, oh, what was the name of Caesar's closest, I can just Google it, you know? And I feel like music theory has moved into that territory. So as you say, that you have a degree in music and you find it easier, you know, to evolve your ideas knowing the music theory. Is it not possible that nowadays you can offset that? If I want to know how to do something specific, I could Google that technique and I would then know it. But then would you consider that me knowing music theory, you know? Because I don't intrinsically know it, but I did seek out the information. Again, this is kind of what I mean by essential. A lot of what we do today with most things is we offset retaining information to the machine. So essentially we use the internet as a subset of our brain. So would you consider that music theory? You know, if you have a view on that, perhaps call in and we can discuss it. So we're going to pull in the Piano Harvard. Can you hear me? Piano Harvard. Your microphone is
Yes,
mute.
I can.
You can hear me.
hear
Welcome
me?
to the stream, sir. Welcome.
It's working. Nice.
Fantastic. So, Piano Halvard, music theory, is it essential for modern composers?
No and yes.
No and yes.
I'll explain it. I'll explain it.
Argue with yourself as much as you like. Go for it.
I just thought of like, what kind of movies or video games or anything for that matter heavily uses music theory and doesn't do it. And I thought of Star Wars.
Right.
Because there are passages like in, for example, Star Wars 3, the battle between Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, like da 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 ba ba da da.
Right. Well,
but
so
then
music theory, like just before you continue on that point, I would argue that that music theory played a very heavy role in the scores to Star Wars. And that is something that I know a lot of people who are fans of music theory and think that it is essential will often look to John Williams as a beacon of music theory. So do you feel that in order to write like, something like Star Wars, music theory is essential for something like that?
Well, just to finish my previous point.
Sure. Go for it.
In Star Wars, I believe it was 4 or 5, I can't quite call it, but there was like a passage that da da dun da 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 ba ba da 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 da. Those are all major chords, and that goes like that breaks every rule, right?
Right. Okay. So you feel that, but do you feel that because John Williams is so knowledgeable of music theory, he knew that they were rules that could be broken?
I mean, yeah.
Well, that's fair enough. But so when you say yes and no, which way are you leaning towards? Do you feel that it's? I mean, I assume you are a composer, correct?
Yeah.
And how often in your daily work routine do you often find yourself going to music theory to write? When you're writing, are you sitting down and are you thinking in musical theory terms, or are you thinking in other terms like orchestration or, one could argue that, well, not argue, but melody, for example. Now, melody is something you can do by ear, or you can go by, the rules, like things like counter. Do we count counterpoint as music theory? I think we do, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So things like this that you do actually do when you're performing, that is music theory. But are you using music theory actively when you write?
I mean, at like the beginning when I'm sketching out a melody, no.
Right.
But my subconscious kind of does it.
Right. So could
like
it not be argued?
If I come up with a melody like la 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 la,
I'm stealing.
I know that that's a minor chord with a minor sixth or whatever.
Right. You know it, but it's not factoring into the decision making, perhaps.
Yeah.
Right. And so it feels like you're actually kind of almost pro music theory, but like in a kind of subconscious way. So do you feel it would actually be beneficial to learn it and then forget about it? You know what I mean? Let your brain absorb the information of music theory, sit in the back of your brain and not use it actively, but it's beneficial to actually know it so that you can use it when called upon.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you actually kind of lean towards the essential, which is fine. So the thing I've been asking people who are pro music theory, do you think that school for music theory is still relevant, or do you think it can be self-taught nowadays?
It can be self-taught. That's why I did it. But then I attended music school for like 1 year because I already knew everything.
You know everything. I'm impressed.
I didn't know everything, but I felt like the way they taught things, there was just something wrong. Like you're sitting there with like 20 other people listening to a teacher just explaining stuff. It was just wrong. I felt wrong.
You felt wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fair enough. But on that topic, like, how do you feel about? So let's say that that there are definitely people out there who know no music theory. Do you feel that it's? I don't like the word, but do you feel that it's perhaps cheating for these people who are offsetting that information to the internet or to apps? Like we said, Captain Chord or whatever it is, or, Chordify. Chordify, I think, is something different. But, these applications which basically fill in the ignorance gap of music theory. Do you feel that that's cheating, or do you feel at the end of the day, the ends justify the means? So long as you create a fantastic piece of music, it doesn't matter how you got there.
I mean, if you compose a fantastic piece of music, how you got there, I don't really give a fuck.
Which would mean that it's not essential.
It's not essential, but it's nice to have. It's one of those things.
I mean, absolutely agree
I'm like
with you
in the
there.
middle of the coin.
Yeah,
I'm kind of pro, but I'm kind of con.
You flipped the coin
yeah.
and it landed sideways on, edgeways on.
Yeah, yeah.
So
exactly.
And I agree with you. I don't think music theory, like if you learn music theory, I don't think you would actually be worse for it. The only risk of music theory, or the only argument for the risk of music theory that I've heard, is that if you get too engrossed in the subject of music theory, you have the potential for stifling creativity. Do you believe that's true? So the more music theory you know, the less creative you become because you end up sticking to the rules.
Absolutely. If you let your subconscious take over, that's it.
Yeah. So,
but if you actively try to like not follow the rules, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Then you get like creative, but it's a difficult question to answer.
And that is why it's the question of the day. Again, it's not a very simple yes or no discussion, which is why we're talking about it. So let me put this question to you. Do you think, for people coming up, people who are getting into the industry, do you think music theory is where they should be starting? Or do you think perhaps nowadays it's more beneficial to learn a DAW first, or learn synthesis first, or perhaps, orchestration over music theory? Or do you feel that music theory is the bedrock on which music should be built from the get-go for new composers?
Ooh, that's a dark one.
A dark one?
Because I have a couple of friends who didn't teach themselves music theory.
Right.
Like they didn't know it, but then they started producing and it sounded good.
Right.
But those were like the Johnny One Note stuff. Like they focused on the sounds.
Right.
But then I focused on music theory first. So if you hear some of my like first pieces I ever put up on SoundCloud or whatever, they sound shit.
Right.
I mean, theoretically, they're good compositions, but from a production standpoint, they are garbage. Absolute shit.
Well, that falls into the category I was talking about with the last caller. Is sometimes, I mean, how do you feel on this? Like, music theory is more about what you say, whereas things like orchestration and synthesis is about how you say it. Which way do you think is more important nowadays? What the actual notes that you're playing, or the way that you're playing them?
The way you're playing them. I mean, if you create a video talking about anything, you can talk about absolute garbage. But if you make it sound interesting, if you make people think that what you're saying is the truth, you know what I mean?
Piano Halvard, you literally just described my stream. So thank you so much for calling in. Is there anything you'd like to say to the chat room before we move on to our next caller?
I'd like to say to you, thank you for having me here. Thank you for the uplifting comment at the end.
You are more than welcome.
I might call in later, but we'll see.
Feel free to do so. I would absolutely love to talk to you again. So everybody in the chat room, please say thank you to Piano Halvard for calling in. Again, if you would like to join the conversation, make sure you join the Discord and put yourself in the queue so that I know that you are ready to talk. Just going to go through a few more of the Twitch comments. So, wait, I already read that one. Hang on, I need to scroll back up. So, Zenteca, there's definitely plugins that can close the gap when it comes to music theory, but understanding why you're using something, I feel, is a skill that is not necessary. But it does garner you to be able to find your way if you ever find yourself lost creating a piece. You know why something works, thus you know what else could work. It's prescriptive, not a law. And that is a very good point, and something if any of our people waiting in the chat room, waiting to call in, maybe perhaps you could talk on that. Maybe music theory, essential, what is your definition of essential? Because, as Zenteca has mentioned, there are times when we hit that brick wall of composition. We're not fully sure what to do next. Perhaps those with music theory, are more likely to know where to go next. So I'm going to pull in our next caller. So this is a caller from the previous show. Craig Peters, welcome back to the show. How are you doing, sir?
How's it going?
It's going fantastic. So far, the stream's running well, and people are calling in. So
Yeah,
far,
yeah.
relatively successful, and I'm enjoying it. So, Craig,
Nice.
today's topic, music theory. Is it essential for modern composers? What are your thoughts?
Oh man, this is a loaded topic, man.
It's absolutely a loaded topic. That's the point.
Yeah, honestly, dude, like coming from like for myself, I came from the metal background. Like I wasn't like, when you're doing metal or death metal stuff, you really don't need music theory. It's almost sort of like jazz in the way of like without, I mean, some of those dudes are gnarly theory dudes.
Yeah.
But I think honestly, to be an essential like the modern composer, like what is that? It's like there's so many things that you need to be good at.
Just to clarify what I mean when I'm saying modern composer in reference of today's show. So I'm talking about modern composers as being two things. Those that are modern as in they are, new to the industry, but also those who have access to from the get-go the internet and modern technology in terms of things like Captain Chord. We're not sponsored by Captain Chord. I didn't even know that was a thing. But like these chord apps and technology which fill in the ignorance gap of music theory. So when that's what I mean when I'm talking about modern composers. Just so sorry to interrupt, but like just to clarify.
Oh no, totally. Yeah, I think music theory, I've always tried to use it as like a way of, if let's say I want to understand how something works, I think it's just like any kind of tool. It's like people saying loops are cheating or what is cheating. You know what I mean?
And
I think
will be a topic for another day.
Yeah, I think if you're stealing other people's music, that's cheating. You don't ever fucking do that. But it's like a loop, like how you decide to use it. It's like if you were an artist and you go to the store and you buy pre-made paint that's already mixed, is that cheating versus you laying out every single piece of
it's the old
colors and
it's the old goat farmer meme. You've heard this one before. It's like I don't use loops because they're cheating, but then I didn't I didn't make the drum myself, so I went and got the goat skin for myself, and now I don't write much music because I spend too much time raising goats. It's that thing where like how far back do you take the cheating? Because at some point, particularly in modern composition, we do very little of the recording stuff ourselves. A lot of it's done for us. So where do you draw the line of cheating, particularly when it comes to music theory? I mean, how do you feel on that?
Yeah. I mean, for me, like the chord app thing, I think that could be useful for people who are maybe wanting to get into music and I don't know where to start, and just being able to like maybe drag in some chords into the piano roll and then analyze it. I mean, from there you can even manipulate it too. So it's like, if you're just like, maybe I have a YouTube channel, I just want to make some music. I don't want to go and try to worry about YouTube copyrights. I just drag in some things, make my own music. It could be useful for that.
Right.
But for like, I think modern composers, what's really essential, I think, is either being able to work quickly. Like the little bit of time I've been able to hang out with some of the composers out there who are, actively working on big projects, like one of the things that I always hear about is like, I need to work quick, especially if you're working in TV or movies, like turnaround time. So if you're, let's say you know music theory really well, being able to draw from that is like, okay, like I want this big band jazz thing. If you're like, well, I don't know how big band is written, you're kind of fucked. But if you're like, oh, well, I've understood, music theory, I can analyze it.
Yeah. So do you agree somewhat with me that music theory nowadays essentially does act more like a cheat sheet than an educational foundation? So it's something you can reference essentially that's, to me, I feel like that's what it's always been. Music theory is the process of people trying things, realizing that people reacted well to it, and then they write that down so that when they come to write their next piece, they know that if I do that, I'm going to get that reaction, which to me is the definition of a cheat sheet. Do you not think?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think the words cheat sheet should be interpreted in a way that's
it's not negative. Not a negative connotation.
It's just like a manual. Like a video I was watching recently with JJ Berthume. I think that's how you say his name. He did a video on harmonic relativity, and he was talking about the idea of just using, let's say, like a major chord and then playing it like on C and then going up 5 steps and then coming back and then sort of relating like relating sort of like an emotional response to it. So you're like, oh, this sounds heroic. or this sounds
Absolutely.
menacing or whatever. Like that's awesome. Like I thought that was really cool because that's kind of like a real world situation.
Yeah, but on that topic though, as you correctly mentioned there, music exists contextually. You know what I mean? There is no objective emotion associated with sound. We apply sound to it based on experience, you know. So sad music sounds sad because we as humans play that over sad things. And so it's like a reference marker. We know that if we hear that, it means sad. The sound itself isn't inherently sad. Does that make sense? So
yeah.
And that I feel is a dynamic subject. So music theory of the past, you know, like do you think the context of music, perhaps particularly as I mentioned earlier with film music and lots of experimentation, do you feel that some of these contextual statements have actually changed meaning over time, therefore meaning that music theory is more dynamic than it is static?
Yeah, like I think especially what you're talking about, like what is sad, you know, like some people might think, oh, I'll play this minor chord on a piano during this scene because people relate minor to sad, but it could be like instrumentation, how you use it in what context. Like I think what's essential for modern composers is one, being able to produce really good sounding stuff quickly, like knowing your tools and being able to like take an idea and send it to somebody, you know, as quick as possible and as good as possible. But just being able to really interpret the job and then do it. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like whether you use theory or whether you just like have a good ear, like that's another thing I think a lot of people don't necessarily work on, is just like being able to use your ear. Like, because there's times I've tried using, let's say, a key, like I'm going to write in a certain key just for experimenting. And a lot of times I would find kind of like, I'm too, I feel like I'm kind of in the box. Versus if I just start dicking around and playing with certain notes and just like maybe like push one note, play a chord here, or what if I move that chord here? What if I add this note? And then sort of letting the sounds that you're getting back, you know, from whatever instrument you're playing inspire you. And I think, you know, that's just as valid as being able to like, oh, well, you know, if you play the seventh note on this chord, you get this sound there. Like, that's great. But I mean, like, you know.
And so which camp, like, I feel like I know which, based on what you just said, I feel like which way you're going to tip. But do you feel like nowadays, particularly with the way that composition and the general culture around music has changed, do you feel that nowadays it's more about what you say or how you say it? I mean, I guess you could be cheesy and say both, but then is that a real answer, Craig?
That's
well, let's look at it like this. Scores to a lot of movies nowadays are hard to remember. However, I feel that I've gone to movies and the music did exactly what it was supposed to do. I felt how I was supposed to feel. I knew that the story was coherent because of the music, and it wasn't always because of what was being said. Again, I always go back to this reference of Hans Zimmer's The Joker theme, which is a single note. And that leans more into how that note is being said rather than what it's saying. So do you think, I'm going to phrase this as a question, do you think that it's more beneficial to a new composer to start with music theory or to start with things like orchestration, synthesis, sound design, learning DAW, technology?
I mean, I think it kind of depends on what you're really trying to achieve as a composer. But yeah, I would say some of the more essential things is being able to know the tools.
Right.
Like a DAW, like, because it's like you can know orchestration, but if you don't know how to, you know,
I mean,
manipulate and massage MIDI data in a way that, you know, that you can't make it sound good, then you probably won't get a lot of jobs.
I mean, I'm gonna absolutely generalize here, but I feel like people who start music theory first are the people who tend to use Sibelius and Dorico, perhaps, you know, or what's the other one, Finale, as their primary. You know, as their primary DAW, where they write music. That tends to be what I've, you know, just based on experience of other composers I meet with. The ones who are really proficient at music theory tend to be the people who write either on paper first or write in the sequencer. Like I work with a guy called Andrew Asano who orchestrates for me. Hey, sorry, Clay donated to £2. Sorry, the music, the theme played. But anyway, so and thank you so much for that. Andrew Osano, he is music theory, like he is good at it, you know. And he whenever I work with him, you know, he writes in, I think, Sibelius first and then brings it into the DAW. Do you feel like, and I that's an absolutely legitimate way to write music, but do you feel like, particularly with time constraints, let's say in like TV or video games where you need to be delivering a lot of music very quickly, do you feel that writing that way first, music theory first, perhaps, you know, let's say that you are better at music theory than you are at orchestration. Obviously, there's people who do both, but do you not feel that nowadays it's actually beneficial to be able to, you know, to create things that say the right thing without having to overthink what they're saying? You know what I mean? So you need to, as quickly as possible, as high quality as possible, say this very specific emotion. Do you not feel that perhaps orchestration first is, or, you know, synthesis first, you know, whatever, technology first, is a more beneficial to a composer and therefore making music theory less essential? The key word.
I'm gonna say because I mean, for me personally, like I've never been like I want to learn hardcore music theory.
Right.
It's more of just like to me, it's always been a way of communicating.
Yeah.
You know, like that's kind of how I've always heard people talk about music theory. Oh, it's a way to like communicate a musical idea. Like as humans, we always have this tendency to just put names on everything.
Well, let me read this statement from the chat room. I mean, Morricane, I guess, like going for Morricone, but like Morricane in chat says, music theory is an attempt to describe why stuff we think sounds good. I mean, is that kind of what you agree with there?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, it's like what sounds good is also very subjective. Like, you know, someone can hear the score for There Will Be Blood and be like, that sounds horrid. But to me, I'm like, that sounds awesome. You know, it's like super out there sounding, but it's kind of like, you know, I wouldn't say is a way of sounds good, but is a way of sort of just like describing like a certain sound. Like if people are like, oh, Lydian sounds very uplifting. Like that's, you know, that's valid. You know, no, it helps me understand it, but.
And again, and this is something. This is what I mean by like I've mentioned it a few times, offsetting. So, for example, let's say that I don't know any music theory, right? I know of music theory. Let's go with that much. And I want to make something sound more jolly. Could I not, you know, theoretically just go to Google and type, you know, ways in which to make my, or go to a forum, ways in which to make my music more jolly, and then someone says the Lydian scale. I go to Google, I type Lydian scale, and it gives me the notes I need to play. You know, that is essentially music theory. But do you feel that that's a valid way of doing it? I mean,
I do that.
Case, but that's my point. And so in that regard, does that not mean that music theory is less essential? And when I mean essential, I mean to know it, to study, to learn it. You know, do you feel that that's my point? Like nowadays, you don't need, it's not essential to learn it because we've offset all that knowledge to the cloud, essentially. You know, like that is what I mean by modern composers. Do you think we actually need to study music theory these days, where, you know, as we have access, you know, we have access to the information on immediate, you know, essentially we are using the internet as part of our brain?
Yeah, I'm gonna say no, man, because like I never went to school for music. I've always just been like, I want to learn it, like get my hands dirty and try to do it,
right?
Or you know, using books. You know, if you buy books or whatever, like going to school, like nowadays, like that's another hot topic. Like, do you need to go to music school to be a professional?
Well, how do you feel on that
industry? No, I don't think so at all. Because honestly, like, you know, I'm happy where I'm at. Like, I never went to music school. I mean, I think I always like have this thing in the back of my head, and maybe a lot of musicians have this too, where you always feel like you need to learn more, or there's like, if I just like keep learning this, you know, like maybe I'll get better, or like you always have this sort of what's the word, like kind of self-doubt, where you're like, maybe I don't know enough, you know. So it's like I'm always like trying to learn more whenever I can, go online, search stuff, or you know, or just the information's out there. Basically, to sum it all up, the information's out there. If you want to learn it, you can learn basically anything you want to learn nowadays.
Right.
The playing field has been leveled.
Absolutely.
So what it really comes down to is your motivation and drive. That is probably the most essential thing. If you're not fucking driven, dude, you're not going to get work. I don't care if you went to school. I don't care if you learned music theory your whole life. If you're not out there like knocking on doors and like fucking making shit happen.
So you agree that music theory these days will not save you in the harsh climate?
Music theory is not going to help you get a job. It's just like there's so many people that go to school for X, Y, and Z.
Which
doesn't mean they're going to, you know.
I would, if I was, you know, being cheeky, I would say that means that you disagree with the statement of today's topic that it is no longer essential. Will you allow me that?
I disagree.
Anyway, Craig, thank you so much for calling in today. I am going to move on. Is there anything you'd like to say to the chat before we move on?
Have a good day.
Enjoy
your weekend.
Everybody in chat, please say thank you to Craig for calling in. A fantastic little chat there. I'm just going to go back and go through some more of the added comments from the chat room. By the way, if you are listening in and you've just joined the channel, you would like to call into the show today, all you need to do so is Discord, and I will post the link in the chat room to how you can join the chat room. All you have to do is put yourself in the queue for questions, and that way I know that you would like to talk. If you are if you've been on the talk, you've already called in, just move yourself out of the queue if you've already spoken. That way I know who's new and who's not. So I'm just going to go through some of the comments we've had in the chat room. So let me just make sure I've found one. So Ojasso says, it's just a language. The more you can understand, the easier it can be to express. I have degrees in music and I do not see myself tied up to the theory books. Now, this is often, again, on that topic, that is something that often comes up when people discuss music theory. One of the, I don't want to say conspiracy theories, but one of the misconceptions, I think, is that the more music theory you know, the less creative you become. And Jesus Christ. Oh, thank you for the donation. I don't know how much Pepsi Max costs, but thank you anyway. Thank you so much for the donation there. I forgot that was the sound, and that scared the shit out of me. Anyway, back on the topic. So one of the misconceptions is that you become less creative the more music theory you know. And there is definitely a pitfall, there are times where I myself have been I've conceptually thought about writing something specific and then gone, actually, no, I'm not allowed to do that according to music theory. And then obviously I give myself a smack upside the face and I do it anyway and try it out. That's one of the actual benefits we have nowadays that they didn't have in the classical era. If we want to try an idea, we can literally try it within seconds. So, theoretically it may not work, but who knows, if you play it in and it kind of works, you can work off of that information. Nick said, you have a vid on YouTube where you're explaining a secondary dominant, but you don't know what it's called. I knew what it was, but you explained it better than a college professor. Well, I thank you for that. I think about music in a very rudimentary way. I heard some Fox2403 says, I heard some composers say you have to know the rules first to break them. What do you think about that? I feel like you can break the rules accidentally, but I know what you're trying to say with that statement. You're trying to say that if I know that I can't do parallel fifths, or is that a thing? I forget. If someone says you can't do that, you may be inclined to go, fuck you, that's all I'm going to do for this piece of music. You can actively go against the rules. Whether or not it sounds good is up for discussion. I mean, if music theory, as I mentioned, is, if you consider it a cheat sheet like I do, if you go against the cheat sheet, which is essentially a list of things that have been proven to work, if you're going actively against them, that would suggest that it's going to be not pleasant, because you wrote it down in the first place because it was pleasant. That was the point. Moricane says, would you say there is only one music theory or are there several? That is a good point. I'm gonna write that down and ask it to our next theory. Only one, or is there multiple? Let's bring in another caller. Again, if you would like to join the conversation, make sure you get on Discord and then join in the queue for questions. So we're going to drag in the Master. The Master, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hi.
Hey, wait 1 second. I'm just going to have to turn up your microphone. You don't have to do anything. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, so the Master, music theory, is it essential for modern composers?
I am the one of them they don't know.
You don't know?
Yes, and I cheat. So I use Cubase 10 and use the chord track.
Use the chord track. And
yes.
So, and do you feel that you're cheating when you do it, or are you one of these people that believes the ends justify the means? So long as you're writing great music, music theory is non-essential, not even important.
Yeah, sometimes I really want to know about that.
Right.
So it's all a little bit slow.
It's all a little bit slow. So you're actually interested in music theory, but you haven't studied it so far. Is that what it is, or have you been unable to? What's the story there?
Maybe it was laziness.
Laziness. That's fair enough. I mean, like that is one of the things of today, because we have access to the internet. Is it essential to actually study music theory when, as I mentioned to our previous caller, you could just go to Google and ask, you know?
Yeah.
Is that what you find yourself doing?
Yep.
So that's
really true. So it's really like you are searching for example, the chord track in Cubase, and you use some other tools. They also help, and you get ahead, and you get ideas from them.
Right, and so tell me about your compositional upbringing. So where did you begin when you first got into music? If you didn't start with music theory, yet you write music, where did you begin your study? Like, what was the first thing about music that you actively started looking into?
I started playing the clarinet, actually.
Okay. So you studied clarinet?
Yeah, I learned it from my dad and played it for a very long time.
But you don't feel that you learned any music theory along the way?
Right, because the clarinet is monophone, and I was never getting into place to play the chords then.
Do you feel that you didn't learn any music theory though when you were, like, let's say for example, melody? Melody can be monophonic. Well, melody is monophonic.
Yeah.
Do you feel that you subconsciously were absorbing music theory as you were playing other pieces? Like the composers were using certain things over, certain types of melody lines over and over again, and they were avoiding doing this note to that note. Did you find that you were absorbing that information?
Yeah.
So could we not argue that was music theory?
Okay, then it was music theory, but it was not really the learning to use the chords.
So if you could study one thing in music today, would you go for music theory, or would you lean on something more textural like orchestration, or something more speed, orientated like technology and DAWs? What would you learn now if you could choose?
A mixture.
A mixture.
Of everything.
I like it. A mixture of everything.
Actually, I'm also a freak in technical stuff.
Right.
And
a tech freak. Love it.
Yeah. And maybe you know Jason Young. I showed him a lot of Cubase stuff.
Okay.
So the technical aspect. And I think it's all. It's the technical. It's maybe I want to learn more about theory.
Right.
But yeah, I have everything to get ahead.
You have everything you need to get ahead. And like someone mentioned before, music, do you think there's only one type of music theory, or do you think there's multiple types of music theory nowadays? Let's say, for example, like jazz theory is technically music theory, but very, very, very different to classical theory.
That's true. It's different. I would say so.
Do you feel that there's theories for every genre? So, for example, do you think there's epic music theory? Trailer music theory, perhaps?
Yeah, I think.
So would we consider... So let's say, for example, like trailer music. We all know what trailer music sounds like. So do you think that new books should be written on trailer music theory? Which, again, I consider music theory like a cheat sheet. So therefore, it would stand to reason that all of the things that work when we do trailers could be considered trailer music theory. Do you think that's a thing that could be?
Yeah, that's a thing. I mean, it's a thing in every direction. I did a lot of electronic music in the past. So it's also a sheet you are going to use.
So how about like compare, as you may, I apologize to keep talking over you. I think there's a bit of a delay. So I'm just going to continue talking now, and I'll let you talk in a second. I apologize. But so perhaps music theory is essential, but genre-specific music theory. So if you are a dance producer, perhaps we need more literature on dance music theory, or on trailer music theory, or on film music theory. Do you think this is something that would benefit composers and then make music theory essential again?
Yeah, I really would think so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for calling in today. Was there anything you wanted to say to the chat room before we move on?
Sorry for my English, as I'm from Germany. It's a problem.
Your English was fantastic, and thank you so much for calling in. I genuinely appreciate it. So everybody say thank you to the master for calling in. That was fantastic. And that is something that came up in that topic, which, we hadn't talked about yet. Genre-specific music theory. Is this something that you think should be considered more often? Perhaps, because music theory, as we understand it, generally we consider to be classical music theory. Do you think there's an industry, a niche for perhaps literature? And when I say literature, I mean written down books and studies on genre specific. Perhaps we need a trailer music theory book. Perhaps we need an electronic music theory book. Again, if you want to have a say on that topic, do join the Discord link there below. I'm just going to go through some of the chat room here. In fact, I just realized that we used up our hour. So these shows are going to be an hour long. So we're actually just coming to the end. So I'm not actually going to be taking any more calls on the music theory question. I think we covered it. What do you guys think in the chat room? Do you think that we had a thorough discussion? Do you think this is a format that we can continue with other questions in the future? What we're going to do now is we're going to move on to questions or, general statements. If anybody has anything they would like to say on stream, it doesn't have to be related to music theory anymore. If you would like to just make a comment or say hello to the chat room or me, feel free to join the Discord. Again, link there down below. Before we leave, though, before we move on to that, I'm going to... Kev, just bear with me 1 second. Before we do that, I'm just going to read a few more of the comments that we had that I missed. So the Master 303 says, I use the chord track in Cubase, as you can also change chords in the track and all instruments follow the chord track. It's even faster for people who can read chords. I agree. Cubase's chord track is fantastic and is one of those tools that fills in what I'm calling, for some reason, the ignorance gap. Again, I'm not using that as a derogatory term. Ignorance just means something you are uninformed on a subject. It's not, it's used derogatorily, but it's not how I'm using it here. So, there are lots of valid tools out there now which fill that ignorance gap. And I absolutely agree. If you understand how they work, you're making your life quicker. So for people who are music theory first, the chord track in Cubase would be beneficial to them, because then what you can do is you can conform all the MIDI notes to the chord track. Very, very good. Ivana13 says, to answer your question about should music theory be an update, I think that means should music theory be updated. What kind of theory are you referring to? Classical one? Because that century has been a whole revolution for music theory, from, I hate pronouncing names, from Schoberg to jazz composers like Stockhausen and more recent composers. Theory boundaries have enlarged enormously. Some people wrote in the 50s and 60s is more modern today of what we could usually hear today. Aha. And that actually goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think that we need to do more research into genre-specific theory, because there are certain aspects, let's say, of metal music. There are certain theoretical concepts there which make it sound like that type of music. And when I talk about music theory being dynamic, I feel that these are subjects which should perhaps be added to the conversation. We should perhaps include genres of popular music using the technology which didn't exist when the music theory books we have today were written. Like trailer music has a very specific theoretical concept behind it. Film music tends to lead nowadays more towards textural. So perhaps we need a full discussion. Perhaps we need a full investigation into those kinds of, subjects. I feel like I agree with your concept there, and I feel that it is worth doing. Again, I'm only reading the comments that have been atted at me. Kaya MZZ says, without music theory, your money at a keyboard for the most... I'm going to reread that. Without music theory, you're a money at a keyboard for the most part. Monkey, perhaps? You're a monkey at the keyboard, I think is what they were trying to say there, but they put money. Okay, I'll read it as monkey. Without music theory, you're a monkey at the keyboard for most part. Eventually, you'll remember what you did that worked, but when expanding your music theory will aiding you getting there faster. Otherwise, it's back to being a monkey at the keyboard. And I agree with you to a point, and that would make sense back in the time before the internet. even just as far as the 80s, before we had access to the internet. My argument now is that music theory is less essential than it used to be because we have the internet. And the way we use the internet nowadays is as a subcontractor of knowledge. For example, if I'm writing something, let's say that I knew music theory, like I studied it and all the information was retained within my old noggin, right? And let's say I went, okay, I want my music to feel happier here. I'll use the Lydian scale, like Craig suggested. Now, my knowledge of music theory doesn't extend into that kind of specifics, but what I do have access to nowadays is the internet. So if I want to do that, I can go on the internet and probably within 10 seconds find all the information I need. So what I'm doing is I'm freeing myself up from the time of study and trying to hammer that information in for recall. Instead, I'm saving the information. I'm saving the process on how to find that information, and then I'm able to access it almost as quickly. So is it essential? I feel like it's not as essential as it used to be, although I take your point that it is still very much something worth knowing. Okay, let's see if we got any more of these questions. Okay, and I feel like that brings us... Oh, no. Hey, we've got a thing. What does that say? Yves has donated £5. Thank you so much for the donation. Again, all donations are going towards buying new sample libraries and things that we can show on the stream. So if you feel like donating, don't worry. I won't spend it all on Pepsi Max. Forks2403 says, are you going to do music theory tutorials? Probably not music theory tutorials, but I would be more than happy to do, genre-specific music theory tutorials, perhaps. The cheat sheets for trailers, that would be something I would consider, because that's a world in which I have been I am quite familiar with. Anyway, so that will bring us to the end of our topic today. Music theory, is it essential for composers? If you're on YouTube, this is where the video will be ending. If you're on live stream, don't worry, we will continue after I do this little outro here, so don't go anywhere. But if you're on YouTube, thank you so much for watching this first episode of Today with Daniel James, which is our weekly talk, chat show, whatever you want to call it, talk radio talk show. I don't know what you'd call it, but it's a live stream interactive format. As you've heard today, you can call in with your opinions on the topic. And today's callers were absolutely fantastic. They were all opinionated and had some very interesting things to say. I was making notes throughout, something perhaps I'll put out on a blog or something like that, so we can reread the information later. This video will go on YouTube, so anybody who missed it or came in late, don't worry, you can listen to all of the calls. If you would like to get involved in a future live stream, make sure to follow on twitch.tv/hybrid2. That's where we're doing these live streams. And make sure you follow on Twitter at H2, as in the number 2, Daniel. So at H2 Daniel. I'll always post there when we're going to go live. But this show, the specific talk radio stream, will be Saturdays, noon PST, so LA time. So you can work that out for where you are. That's noon my time. So it'll probably be like 8 p.m., I guess, UK time. And I guess, I don't know what time for people on the, in Japan or something like that. But if you're on YouTube, follow, subscribe, bell, all that, shit. And thanks for watching. If you're on stream, stick around. But on YouTube, everybody in the chat room, say bye to the YouTubers. We'll see you in the next one.